Hello, everybody, and welcome to part one of the performance testing series. Today's topic is planning for performance testing in Microsoft Dynamics 365. My name is Peggy, and I'll be your moderator today. We're broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you're agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout today's session and as well as at the end. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Kicking us off today from Microsoft, we have Davey Vliegen, Senior R&D Solution Architect. Davey, over to you.
Thank you, Peggy. Hello, and welcome to today's topic is planning for performance testing. As the first one, as already called out of a performance testing Tech Talk series. My name is Davey Vliegen, and with me today I have my colleagues Marcus Otte, Zach Olson, and Dave Berman. If you have any questions during the session, feel free to ask them straight away through the Q&A panel. Let's start with a small commercial for the Dynamics 365 implementation guide. This book has been written by fast-track solution architects, and it provides prescriptive guidance on how to run a successful implementation of Dynamics 365. Related to the subject of today's Tech Talk, a special attention to chapter 17 out of the book, which is called A Performing Solution Beyond Infrastructure, as well as chapter 14, Testing Strategy. The link you can see here on the slide. The objectives of this Tech Talk today is to explain the importance of performance testing and the need for careful planning. Questions that pop up are how to identify key business scenarios. Why do we need to document performance goals objectives? The necessary prerequisites for successful performance testing will be explained, as well as the key elements that a performance testing strategy should include. What we do not cover today is how to set up and execute performance tests. We also do not go deeper into the details how to analyze and mitigate performance issues. But as you know, this is the first session out of a whole series of Tech Talks dedicated to Dynamics 365 performance testing. So the questions that I just raised, how to set up and execute or how to analyze and mitigate performance issues, they will be covered in the next sessions. So we already start with the second session on April 4th, where we will explain setup and execution for finance and operation apps. So the performance testing, where we utilize some tools and some demos. So it will really be a much more hands-on Tech Talk. So it will be already delivered on Monday, April 4th. On April 21st, we will have part 3, which is considerations for Dataverse and customer engagement apps. Part 4 will be a follow-up on part 2 for finance operations, where we go into the analysis and mitigation of performance issues, which is scheduled for the 27th of April. And then not scheduled yet, but 2 that are already in a draft version and we are working on them is part 5, which is setting up Dynamics 365 commerce performance test, which will go deeper into how to set up performance tests for the POS and e-commerce components. As well as a part 6, which is a day in a life testing for finance and operation apps. These days will be announced soon and will be added to the Tech Talk series page. There are more Tech Talks to come that are in the internal planning phase, I would say. So during the next month, some additional topics will be added. So today's agenda, we start with explaining the importance of performance testing and how you should plan for it, followed by identifying key business scenarios and defining performance goals or objectives. Next, we will explain some other important prerequisites to take into account for successful performance testing. And finally, we explain the key elements a performance testing strategy should consist of. There will be time for additional Q&A at the end of the session, but again, do not hold your questions because I know my colleagues are eager to answer them during the session. But also be aware that not every very specific detailed question to a certain app or technology can be answered in the scope of this Tech Talk today. Often we also refer to some next Tech Talks that I just mentioned that are on the schedule or will be soon be scheduled. So let's start with the first topic, the importance of performance testing. Performance testing is, as you know, a key element of any successful Dynamics 365 implementation. It will ensure scalability and reliability of the solution. It pinpoints to potential bottlenecks prior to go live, and it will also ensure that the solution enables the business to achieve its goals. And finally, it will help to discover opportunities to further optimize the solution. To illustrate it a bit more, I want to highlight a few samples from the implementation guide. If you think the first sample about a web shop, customers might use integrated applications with a direct dependency on Dynamics 365 apps, for example, through a sales website. And in such a scenario, poor performance can quickly turn into loss of sales for a customer abandon the website to shop elsewhere. No one enjoys a frustrating and slow sales experience, right? And customers can quickly switch to a different business to purchase goods and services. A second example I want to highlight of call out here is the call center. Often customers interact with systems indirectly through an agent within an organization. For example, when a customer calls a call center to discuss a faulty product or delayed order shipment, I think we have all been in such a situation. These type of interactions can be challenging for a business already to resolve in a positive way and are only made more challenging if suddenly the agent cannot access the information in a timely manner. So this illustrates again that system performance is key to ensure a positive customer experience, regardless of whether the customer interacts with the system directly or indirectly. We often get the question, why should we plan for performance testing? This is Microsoft's responsibility because it's a cloud solution. The reason why is that Microsoft is indeed fully committed to build a scalable platform and the standard solutions. But anything that is added to the core Dynamics 365 apps, think about integration, analytics, reporting, data constellation setup, users, customization, specific ISVs, has the potential to negatively impact the performance. And this impact needs to be understood and managed to ensure performance remains acceptable. The on-premise mindset of fixing software problems with additional hardware is expensive, and to be honest, usually only a temporary fix. And even more important, it is also often does not solve the issue. Because if you design a solution that does not scale, it does not help to throw more hardware to it. For all these reasons I mentioned, it should be crystal clear that responsibility, definitely the end responsibility of delivering a well-performing solution is with the project team. If you look into the differentiation between the task, we know that performance is a shared responsibility between the customer, the implementation partner, and Microsoft. So this slide is more meant for reference purposes. It highlights some of the key responsibilities. And these key responsibilities, of course, can shift from project to project. But as a sample here, a customer definitely owns the solution, describes business goals and predict transactional volumes. And customer also plans, in this case, for performance testing and make sure relevant resources are available for it. The implementation partner builds the solution, document customer processes, capture performance, non-functional requirements, and builds a scalable solution. The implementation partner here is providing expertise and support for the performance testing execution. Say, for example, because it could also be that the performance test responsibility is maybe with a separate party, correct? Microsoft managed the platform. We ensure that the core platform components have sufficient resources. We deliver solutions for performance issues within the Microsoft scope. When you log a support ticket, it's a standard issue, performance issue, there is a resolution, there will come a resolution for it. But we also support investigations into performance issues outside of the Microsoft scope when you need additional expertise. So in the next section, we explain the importance to plan for performance testing. When you're planning for performance testing, there are a few important aspects to keep in mind. First, make sure performance testing is part of the overall project plan. We often see in project this is missing, and we come back to this with an example in the next slides. Secondly, allow sufficient time to prepare and run multiple iterations. It's important to consider performance testing as an ongoing topic rather than a one-time activity at a particular point within the implementation. For example, it's likely that multiple iterations of testing and optimizing will be required rather than a single performance test, as the effect of any change made to optimize performance will need to be validated. This is especially relevant in more agile implementations where evolving requirements can lead to significant changes in functionality over time. The project plan should also have the right expert resources allocated to ensure the testing is done well and results are correctly interpreted, as well as poor performance areas are actioned rapidly. We also recommend a single owner to be assigned to drive performance planning and remediations across the development teams during all phases of the project. Start with a macro plan, which defines the overall timetable and integration with project test phases and data migration phases. And next, define a more refined plan, which maps to the detailed project sprint plan. So performance expectations from the project match with the expected, for example, volumes of data entities through data migration and so on. So in this picture is a sample where we show a waterfall implementation methodology, and the different phases are highlighted: analysis phase, design, develop, test, and finally deploy. And the question is, when should we plan for performance testing? To answer this question is that we need to start early and already consider performance from the early stages to ensure that the correct expectations are set in terms of time, budget, and people. For example, for performance testing, a dedicated performance test environment is needed, and we will come back to that later in the presentation, as well as the people to do the testing. Business stakeholders might need additional time with the delivery team to understand, agree with, and document performance requirements. And it might even be necessary to allocate more development time and resources for code optimization. Training is also an important aspect. So educate the project team on performance considerations and tools during the analysis phase. But also it's really important to train all users to be sensitive to performance issues during test phase. The recommendation and the strong message I want to give here is that never ignore any performance issue during a test cycle. Dealing with performance issues after functional testing is completed can create additional project risks because the changes needed to resolve them are typically significant and therefore come with a high risk of introducing bugs. This essentially invalidates any prior functional testing, right? And a regression testing cycle is then required to ensure performance fixes haven't broken the previous tested functionality. This wastes time at a critical stage of the project. So if you consider performance throughout the project, it will ensure the final solution to be performant, scalable, and optimized. If your project, and of course then also your project plan, has multiple phases, like in the picture here, performance testing should be planned for each phase. It's really important. So in the last few slides, I showed you an example of the waterfall implementation methodology, but as you know, there are several other implementation methodologies, and it's important to highlight that each implementation methodology influences the performance testing plan. Just like implementation methodologies, there are also different methodologies to performance testing, and each methodology targets a different type of testing. Some typical examples: waterfall typically starts at the end of functional development, and the goal is to ensure that the solution scales based on expected volume. This is often done by simulating user load and transaction volume for a period of time to capture response time metrics. Agile, often developed alongside functional development sprints, the goal is to test functionality that includes performance metrics related to end user experiences. Good example of these tests are Selenium-based test scripts and unit testing codes, and more of these samples will come in one of the next tech talks out of the series here. So question is now how to identify the key business scenarios to be included in the performance testing. To answer this question, we must first understand the solution. It's a prerequisite to identify the key business scenarios. It's important to select the key business scenarios together with the business. Spend time with users as a project team to understand the activities for which performance plays a critical role. Agree on these areas with project stakeholders and then focus performance-related work, these activities, to maximize the value of the efforts. And remember that performance is a trade-off, so it's absolutely crucial to understand where to focus the efforts. Business scenarios often span across different components, and when selecting the key business scenarios for your solution, it's important to take the entire end-to-end business scenario into account. When selecting the key business scenarios, consider business impact and risk of poor performance due to high transaction volumes, complexity of automated processing, high concurrency, complex integrations, limited time available to complete the process, as well as there might be others. It's also worth considering any planned customization in conjunction with the key business scenarios identified with users. Customization can introduce a performance overhead and need to be carefully managed to ensure performance remains acceptable. Having a good understanding of how any customization maps onto any performance critical activity ensures special attention is given to performance during design and implementation phase. Also, when making the selection of key business scenarios, consider performance testing for each system area. This includes functional processes, background operations like batch workflows, integrations, and reporting and analytics. In the case of high volume integrations, consider when and how often these will run. Heavy processing can place a strain on the application, and if this happens at the same time that users are interacting with it, issues are likely to arise. This is particularly important to consider for global businesses whose systems might be in almost continuous use. These different scenarios can be glued together then into a day in a life testing scenario at a later stage. We will have a dedicated session on this as part of this Tech Talk series, like I announced at the beginning of this Tech Talk. A separate scenario to cover is data migration performance. When planning a data migration, it's important to understand the business requirements for the data being migrated. Implementation teams sometimes decide to migrate far more data than required and then run into performance issues due to the size of the data set. There are, of course, many other reasons for poor data migration performance, and This is the reason why testing is so super important. So once we select the key business scenarios, the next question is how to define the performance goals and objectives. Similar then with the selection of the key business scenarios, we must define the performance goals and objectives in agreement with the business. It's absolutely vital that performance be considered like any other requirement and gathered in the initial stages of the implementation. If the business struggles with providing performance objectives, it might help to reverse the question and ask what would not be an acceptable performance. This is sometimes a lot easier to answer for them. Acceptable performance is the goal of every project, but the definition of acceptable is often vague, if defined at all. And to successfully deliver acceptable performance, we need to be clear on what that means, then to be able to track progress against our performance goals. If the defined performance goals are not realistic, the risk is these cannot be reached and would probably lead into an escalation, or even worse, wouldn't be taken seriously. In this situation, it's advisable to run small proof of concept pilot projects to understand feasibility as early as possible, thereby minimizing the risk of accepting unachievable requirements. Discuss requirements that are unachievable with the business is generally a more positive discussion during the early stages of the project than during user acceptance testing or immediately before going live. The performance objectives should also be documented as non-functional requirements. And a sign-off of the a sign-off of the performance non-functional requirements is an important aspect as well, and should be done by the stakeholders owning the overall solution. It is also important to have the right support to carry them through the project. As a next step, the typically less specific performance goal should be translated into acceptance criteria. It is uncommon for a developer to deeply understand the business context of the system for which they are developing code. A developer likely might not have experienced the time-pressured environment of a call center, for example, or order fulfillment center, and therefore won't be able to judge the need for performance. And therefore, specific performance goals should be translated into acceptance criteria or functional requirements to ensure that developers have visibility to performance constraints on the functionality for which they are responsible for. So we talked so far about the importance of planning for performance testing, as well as selecting the key business scenarios and defining the performance goals. But there are some other important prerequisites. These prerequisites are volumes, geolocation strategy, user personas, data composition, performance testing tools, finally, performance test environments. It is worth to emphasize why prerequisites like volumes and data composition are important aspects to consider for performance testing. What we often see is that performance issues appear a few weeks or even months after post-go live. When transaction volumes are increasing, data constellation is changing. So this is why it's so important to run performance tests with the expected volumes as well as a realistic data set. Volumes start with documenting a first estimated of expected users and transaction volumes. And these estimates do not need to be exact. So having an approximate understanding of the order of magnitude of transactions is sufficient at this stage. From a performance standpoint, the difference between 100 or 200 transactions per hour will not make a difference. But on the other hand, the difference between 100,000 or 1 million or 1,000 and 1 million is significant, correct? So identify the times of peak workload It is a time of the day with potential for performance issues. However, it might be that this peak workload happens only once a month or even once a year. So typical examples are month-end closing or weekly time registration on a Friday afternoon. Also plan for seasonality in the system load, for example, during the end of the year. When doing the exercise to identify the times of peak workload, also identify times of minimal load, which may offer opportunities to pick a more suitable time for running integrations or background jobs, with the aim of distributing the load more evenly across the day. Consider the roadmap of the business as well as design requirements for an increase in demand on the system. Transaction and user volumes play an important role in the overall success of the performance testing. And finally, be aware of service protection limits for both customer engagement as well as for finance and operation apps. The links to more detailed information are shared in the deck. Geolocation strategy. So cloud solutions remove many of the infrastructure considerations necessary in other software development projects. However, one key consideration that needs to be made is choosing the right data center, where in the world the solution will be located physically. And we know this is not solely a performance consideration, but for the intent of this tech talk, we focus on the performance aspect only. For more information regarding other considerations, I would like to refer to Chapter 9, the Environment Strategy of the Dynamics 365 Implementation Guide, which I advertised before. If we focus solely on the performance aspect, we can say that if users are located in one particular geography, the optimal data center is likely to be the one physically closest to those users. However, many Dynamics 365 solutions are implemented for global organizations and need to cater for users located across the globe. And in this situation, the decision becomes more complex and should be guided by the locations of those users and a need to provide all users with an acceptable latency. And note this may involve some users having less than optimal latency, but still within the acceptable boundaries. There are some interesting links in this slide regarding product availability, system requirements, as well as guidance how to run the first latency tests. It's important to validate if there is a plan for multiple environments or tenants across geographies or regions. This is not part of the current tech talk, but for more information, you can visit the links mentioned on the slide. And finally, as an overall recommendation, it's important to have geolocation strategy in place prior to designing the solution. So this discussion should happen at a very early stage of the project. User personas. So for a successful performance test, project teams should have a good understanding of the different user personas, and this includes user locations, user security configurations, data typically associated with each type of user, and the expected number of concurrent users divided by persona. It's important to define day-in-a-life activity profiles aligned to each persona. Customers should also have sufficient number of user licenses to be able to realistically model the behavior during performance testing, so take this into account. Data composition. It's important to plan the data composition used for performance testing. The configuration of the system should be realistic and based on the expected configuration of the production environment. So use real security configurations for the test users. And for the transactional data, work with volumes of data anticipated in production. For example, production data, which is live for 1 year, 2 years, so we need a certain volume here. Use the full set of data migration as a starting point for that, And for finance and operation, apps make sure to include things like opening balance, inventory quantities. And from there, build up a realistic data set. Performance testing tools. So the right selection of tools is key to the success of performance testing. We need tools for building the test data set, as mentioned in the previous slide. We also need tools to run the performance tests. Instead, we could also have an option for manual perf testing. And finally, to analyze the performance testing results, we also use a certain tool set. Because there are multiple tools available in the market, it's really highly advisable to run some proof of concept to find out which tools helps the best and covers all your business needs, performance testing needs. For more detailed guidance, I invite you all to join our next Tech Talks as part of this performance testing Tech Talk series, where we have some more hands-on samples and where we will also have some demos with certain tool set. Performance test environments. So choose a performance test environment that is representative of the production environment whenever possible, and make sure that the performance test environment is in the same region as your future production environment. And keep in mind that if performance issues arise within a scaled down test environment, it is incorrect to assume that performance will improve in an environment with more resources. So without understanding the root cause of the performance issue, it's impossible to determine whether additional infrastructure will help at all. So as mentioned earlier, it's absolutely crucial to understand and address performance issues early, rather than assuming they will go away once you're in production. If there are integration scenarios in the performance test plan, all the related aspects should be identified and documented. The performance test environment should always have a reliable counterpart in the integration systems. The development and configuration of those tools or environment must be taken into consideration during the planning phase. Dedicated performance test environment is generally recommended for two main reasons. First of all, performance test results are meaningful only if testers are aware of the activities occurring on the system during the test, right? So a performance test is worthless if an unexpected process places suddenly additional demand on the system during the test execution. And secondly, it's common for performance testing to occur around the same time as user acceptance testing. Performance testing can take quite some time to execute and push the system to its limits, and thereby disrupting any other testing activities. So a dedicated performance testing environment ensures that performance testing can happen in parallel with other testing activities. Specifically for the finance and operation apps, the project team should recommend the appropriate environment tier based on expected load and volumes. And more details can be found in the link mentioned here on the slide, but for customer engagement apps as well, you also should be aware of capacity implications caused by performance test environments. So also take this license part seriously and into account. So far in this Tech Talk, we have covered all the important aspects to consider when planning for performance testing. And as a final step, all of this should be documented in a performance testing strategy. The performance testing strategy is usually part of the overall testing strategy. And as mentioned before, for more information about testing strategy, I really advise you to read chapter 14, testing strategy, of the Dynamics 365 implementation guide. Performance testing strategy ensures that the system performance is measurable and also provides a clear indication of whether performance is acceptable. It should describe all the principles to be considered for performance testing, and it should include a holistic plan on how performance considerations are incorporated within project methodology and activities. And also finally, it should also include a plan for when and where this will be included in the project plan. The practical execution, as we can call it. So on the next two slides, I want to show you a sample structure of a performance testing strategy. Again, as a sample, how it should look like or what it should contain. So starting from the key business scenarios and performance goals, the test approach should be defined. It could be manual versus automatic testing, as well as the different workload mixes should also be described in detail. And as mentioned before, performance testing is very rarely a one-time activity. Mostly it's an iterative process. And if a low effort performance testing approach isn't available, it can be tempting to skip performance test iteration to gain time, which is not recommended at all, because the risk is that you go live with a system that doesn't perform. On the other side, you can have a fully automated process, including environment provisioning and data setup, can be executed frequently with minimal effort, provide a clear picture of variations in performance in response to specific changes. Say more details regarding manual versus automated testing will also be covered in the next Tech Talk of the Performance Testing Tech Talk series, which is scheduled for next Monday. The performance testing strategy should also include all the prerequisites that have been discussed in today's Tech Talk. And next, the roles and responsibilities should be described. It is recommended that a team structure is created with a defined leader, and all other roles and responsibilities should be identified. Think about technical architect, functional architect, developers, testers. As mentioned before, performance testing should have a single owner that can drive planning and remediation across all teams and all project phases. The performance testing strategy should also include the various means of measuring and remediating performance. Start with ensuring that the design for key business scenarios will scale and deliver the required performance. And more detailed guidance on remediation steps will be part of one of the next Tech Talks of this Tech Talk series. And finally, the output of the performance testing activity should be documented clearly so that interpretation is straightforward. The result should be mappable to performance testing criteria and enable the team to quickly access whether the requirements were achieved or whether there are still gaps between requirements and results. It's also important that the information is documented in the same way and a consistent way with the defined template, because the team might need to compare various performance test run results and changes are made. So this concludes today's session on planning for performance testing. And I want to invite you all to the next Tech Talks, which will cover more details regarding performance testing in Microsoft Dynamics 365. And with that, I would like to give the word to my colleague, Markus Otte.
Thank you, Davey. So let's review a little bit the Q&A. I believe we have answered quite some questions already, but probably it would make sense for the audience to also read them out. There were some questions regarding the expected configuration for the performance test versus the production environment. And the idea is really when you run a performance test that in terms of configuration as well as on the data set and the data composition, you are as close as possible to the real life scenario. So in terms of configuration, that the integrations on the subsequent on the other systems surrounding the core solution are also available, as mentioned by Davey already, and configured, and also do their job in terms of pushing things to Dynamics or receiving messages from Dynamics. to ensure that if you run the performance test, all areas of the entire solution are also challenged and tested. And if bottlenecks appear, they can also be mitigated during the performance test versus a scenario where you run in those integration scenarios into issues during or after go live, which is for sure the worst thing you can experience during a go live. The other thing is regarding data set. So what we usually recommend is really to have the full set data migration already been executed before you run the performance test. And while executing iterations of performance test, then you also create transactional data as needed, if not already created via data migration. And then the third part is the configuration of the software that influences the code execution, meaning that the configuration of the modules and the areas that are used is really as close as possible to the final scenario where you want to go live with. If you do performance testing throughout the whole project implementation, then of course that's not potentially available at the very start. But as you evolve during probably an agile implementation methodology during sprints, so configuration is added, also data migration is added as you go. You can kind of rerun the performance test while the configuration and the data migration is evolving over time. So in an ideal world, with the last iteration of performance testing, you are really very close to the configuration in all aspects to what is expected during the go live. The second main area of questions was around environments. And I believe that has mentioned by Davey also during the presentation that environment planning is really the key. And as I mentioned in the answer, while you can kind of start doing smaller performance tests on smaller sized environment, it really depends on the final expected throughput that in the iterations where you really want to hit the limits about the expected workload, then before you start that exercise, you have the correctly sized environment being available and part of your subscription and all the other components. Yeah, all this kind of aspects are also covered in the environment planning tech talk, where probably in the next 15 minutes we can also post the link into the chat window for the people who haven't yet found that. So these were the two areas where the most question came from.
Yeah, and regarding that tech talk, that's then focused to finance operation apps, correct, Marcus? Because
yes,
just to be specific.
The story is a little bit different on the C side. Probably Dave, you want to talk about that? Sorry for putting on.
Sorry, in terms of the capacity impact for performance environments.
Testing.
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously crucial to ensure that you're performance testing in an environment that's got representative data volumes in it, and as such, there comes a sort of implied impact on capacity consumption. I think it's really just a case of managing that and balancing the need to performance test and the need to gain confidence that you're not going to run into performance issues after go live, with budgetary constraints and making best endeavors to really get your environment as representative as possible within the capabilities that you've got within a project. Appreciate that's not always, you know, achievable, but by and large, this really is a, you know, a valuable activity, and it's really pays dividends to make as much effort as you can to make sure that you're, you know, you're not going to be having performance problems after go live. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you, Dave.
Any other questions to highlight or unanswered ones?
No, these were really the both topics that were asked, and I hopefully covered them in writing as well as wording. There is one remaining question I published already, but I yet haven't replied to that. I'm just going through the new questions now. So Fake Ask is ideal approach to do performance testing for integration elements as post-data migration and done in parallel to other ongoing integration that overlaps. Yeah, so this is really the scenario that was described by Davey in the day in the life test, where all the workloads overlaps in an ideal world. While in early stages of the project, you probably do performance testing on isolated scenarios, probably just let the integrations execute or do all background processes just execute without even having users on the system. Then also, if there is expensive reporting and analytics expected, that those things are just pushed to the environment and automatically executed without having user or user load being created, and then adding the functional processes by either having a lot of users accessing the system at the time when you plan for the performance test, or use tools like Perf SDK to synthetically create load, or have a mixture of both. So because there is still a difference between having a small set of test cases being automated and with parallel executions doing Perf SDK, and then having still a number of users randomly accessing the system with their test cases, which are more, let's say, randomly executed and not in an automated way when you automate each and every last mile, so to speak.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. And I think also that for this day in a life testing, there will be an interesting one coming soon, being announced and scheduled as part 6 of this series.
Yeah, and for the one with the automation and not having actually users being accessing the system, the part 2 will be the interesting one with setup and execution in terms of automation using Perf SDK.
I have here one question I can just call out when you search the next one, Marcus, regarding F&O, specific about the subscription estimator. If it can be used as a base plan for performance test environment. Yes, that's exactly what I mentioned, correct? So you should do a first estimate, rough estimate about transaction volumes and as well as number of users at the early stage of the project. So you know then in a way what size of environment that you might need for a performance point of view when you do your final volume testing. So yeah, that's definitely a pre-step here, subscription estimator. I didn't mention this tool explicitly in this tech talk because it's too specific for finance and operations, correct? And it's different for CE, and we try to stay a bit more generic in this first tech talk. But yeah, the answer is yes to that question. Marcus, any other question?
Yeah, there is one additional explanation to the topic that I mentioned. So yes, the idea is really if you have, for instance, the scenario I'm calling out here to quote the post example, customer data for 1 million records are migrated, and post-migration system like integrations are trying to create dash update customer records with probably 2 million records then pushed via integrations. So reading this, for me, this for sure would be a scenario which I would add or highly recommend to add to a performance test. And then, yes, having the data set ready with the first set of customers migrated, and then configuring the integrations to just execute the other updates that are expected from the integrations, while probably other users are doing also updates to customer data and the same entities. And then to make it even more complex, if you then think about a scenario where you have customer engagement as well configured and dual write also, so there might be sales representatives working on the customer engagement side and updating either the same or other customers as well. So this is for sure an interesting scenario, which then I would highly recommend to add to the performance testing.
I see. Another question we had was, do you recommend to run performance tests prior to sign off of standard application updates, even when you have no additional customization added? I mean, the recommendation is here to do performance testing definitely before each new phase of the project or rollout, correct? So if the load doesn't change drastically or your volumes will not go up drastically and you do an update, then what we highly recommend and should be mandatory is regression testing, correct? But that's a bit out of the scope of this tech talk, but performance testing, volume testing is recommended for each additional rollout or phase rather than for each update, if I explain this correctly to all of you.
Makes sense to me, at least.
Okay, so and then can you share documentation? So yeah, of course, all these tech talks all the recordings will be made available as well as the next tech talk. So if you miss one out of the series, you can also watch the recording. Regarding testing strategy, I provided a sample in this tech talk. We don't have any other more detailed sample, I would say, available to share. These are always very specific towards certain customer projects, so that we don't have. We might plan in the future some tech talks where we share more our experience working with certain projects, but we also need to be careful on what we share, correct? Because what I try to do is just to highlight in the sample what the performance testing strategy, what components it should contain, but you also know it differs a bit from project to project, correct? The structure and the order. I think this should be definitely a starting point.
The next question is around how to prepare cross-app business scenarios and like SCM, e-commerce, customer engagement. So, I mean, this is the reason why we have the series of tech talks on that topic. And hopefully, if we are at stage 5 at least for the scope of the question, then we should have an idea how, and the audience as well, how we can put that all together. And again, it really depends on the solution that is going to be implemented, right? So if the scope is really covering all the solutions and there are performance critical aspects in all corners of the solution, then in the ideal world, then also the performance test would cover all those aspects of the overall solution.
Yeah, and I think with cross-app scenarios, we can probably go endless in this series here. So what we have some internal ideas we are brainstorming. We definitely want to do something also about the CE, F&O, dual write integration, performance testing. So there are others that will come. But every scenario, like Marcus mentioned, is impossible to cover in this series. But definitely between C and finance operations, we plan as well an additional tech talk in the future, perf testing. So we are almost out of time. I don't know if there is still maybe one that we can take.
I'm not aware of any open question, to be honest.
Okay, so even better.
Then we give it back to Peggy.
Yeah, so I would first still would like to thank you all for today. And I really hope that you will also join the next Tech Talk series. And yeah, thank you for today. And like Marcus said, now over to Peggy.
Thank you so much, Davey. So I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. So if all the attendees could have a look there and click on that link, we would love your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. So thank you so much for your participation there. As a reminder, as we discussed today, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. So again, a big thank you to our presenters and our audience. Have a great day or evening wherever you are.